Hello, and welcome to this walkthrough of how I built my over-engineered workbench. I also made an overview video of the workbench with a complete walkthrough of all of its features. Make sure to check it out and subscribe to my channel to stay updated for future videos. I wanted to use my workbench for casting concrete sinks and countertops, so I needed the legs to be independently adjustable to make it perfectly level. Here you can see the leg lifting mechanism after it's completed. It works so that you can adjust an inner leg by twisting a threaded rod that lift or lower that individual leg. I've sketched it up here in Fusion 360. So this is actually not the actual dimensions and stuff. So I did this after I actually constructed it. As you can see, the top part here is consists of basically just a laminated pine, like 4x4 or so, which has a hole in the middle and then a smaller hole on the other side where the rod will go through. And then the lower part is basically a solid block with a slot mortise in the middle here for locking. And then in between those are a steel plate on both sides. And if we take off the upper leg, you will see that there's a rod going through. It's basically a threaded rod with a nut that is welded in place in the top, and then it goes through this plate here, and that plate also have a nut that is welded stuck to the plate itself. So when you twist the rod, this plate moves up and down. And as you'll see, there's a spike here in the end of the rod, and this basically goes down into the other plate, pushes it down. I have a housing that sits around this, and also this housing means that whenever you're cranking the opposite way, you will basically lift the legs. So this is basically what it looks like. So obviously when you crank this, you will move this plate and thereby the upper portion of this leg. So as you can see, you can now unscrew this, and that basically moves the entire construction. And then this is the entire leg that is put in place. There's a locking bolt that is basically stuck on the other side here, and then you can use it to lock the leg in place. You don't actually need that. Here you can see a cross-section of how it all looks. This is the pine laminate, and here's the threaded rod inside. Yeah, so it's relatively simple, and it actually works much better than I thought. When I designed this, I'm not a good mechanical designer. I thought it might work and just sketched it out on paper and put it together, and it works just fine. To make it, I started by cutting all the pieces to correct dimensions. I then ground a rounded tip on the threaded rods and added a nut that I welded in place and ground it all to a point. I then closed off one end of a square tube, making small cubes that will make sure the leg lifts off the ground when being retracted. This is what the rods look like when they're done: a bullet in one end and a nut in the other. I then welded a nut on a square plate and welded the cubes on the other square plate. After all of the welding, I glued up the stocks for the inner legs, and after some sanding, cutting, and slot mortising for some through bolts that will secure the legs when they're in place, this is what the final inner legs look like. To complete the legs, I assembled the outer legs with screws so I can disassemble them later in case anything breaks. Moving on to the bench itself, I routed the skirts with a locking bit. This made the glue up a bit easier and possibly added some strength. Since I wanted the bench to be super sturdy, I made a torsion box inside of the skirt. This is what the finished box with the legs look like. Then I over-engineered some more by adding an unnecessary complicated fixture for the wheels. And the upper part of the bench is now complete. For the lower part, I'm making pull-out drawers for my tool containers. To save material, I made the drawers as individual frames and then glued them together. This is what it looks like when they're finished and installed. Then it was time for the more interesting bit of this build: building and installing a dovetail chain drive vise from Lee Nielsen. The first thing I did was to glue a piece of walnut to the bench at the inner jaw of the vise. After that, I made the outer jaw as two separate parts made with plywood and walnut. It's easier to make them as two parts since you need to make room for the chain and the sprockets inside of the jaw. After that's glued together, I glued on some walnut on the sides to make it look like it's made of solid walnut. I then put some finish on it, made a matching handle and installed the rest of the hardware. Finally, I installed a replaceable sheet of MDF that I drilled 20mm holes in, and the bench is now done. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let me know in the comments if you have any ideas for videos you'd like to see.